They promised the 18th century a miracle born from fire and sand. What they delivered was a catastrophe in the shape of a rainbow. This is not a story about good versus evil. It is a story about the cold, hard calculus of survival. It's about the moment a glimmer of hope becomes a shimmering, perfect lie. In the heart of Europe, the Austrian Empire projected an image of unshakable power, its Baroque palaces gleaming, its armies marching to the drumbeat of Habsburg authority. And within this empire, Bohemia was its jeweled workshop, a land whose artisans could spin sand into crystals so pure it was the envy of Versailles. Their craft was a pillar of the economy, a testament to a dynasty of skill passed down through generations. But beneath this gilded facade, the foundations were cracking. For the local aristocracy, the pressure from Vienna was immense. One such man was Count von Und zu Harrach, a nobleman whose title was as long as his list of debts. His lands were rich, but his coffers were bleeding, a slow, silent hemorrhage of capital to fund a lifestyle the empire demanded. He stood on a precipice, the honor of his house measured against the cold, unforgiving numbers in a ledger. He needed more than a good harvest. He needed a miracle. And a miracle is precisely what he was offered. The story of the Crystal Empire begins not in a boardroom or a bank, but in the searing heat of a glassblower's furnace. Anton Richter was a master of his craft, a man whose hands understood the secret language of molten silica. He wasn't an alchemist or a visionary, he was an artisan, dedicated to the singular pursuit of perfection. One day, through a fluke of chemistry, a mismeasured flux, a trace mineral in the sand, he created something impossible. A piece of crystal that didn't just refract light, it held it. A captive rainbow shimmered within its depths, an iridescent sheen that seemed to breathe. It was beautiful. It was a masterpiece. To Richter, it was the pinnacle of his art. But to another man, it was the key to a kingdom. Enter Dr. Helmut, a physician whose career in Vienna had ended under a cloud of scandal and whispers of charlatanism. He possessed a brilliant mind, but it was untethered by morality. Where Richter saw beauty, Helmut saw an angle. He saw the gaping void in the heart of the Enlightenment, a desperate, aristocratic hunger for mysticism, for elixirs and secret knowledge in an age that was rapidly discarding God. They sought control, a way to cheat death and decay, and they would pay any price for it. Helmut took Richter's beautiful accident and wrapped it in a mythology. This was no mere crystal, he declared. This was a harmonic resonator. The unique rainbow vibration, he explained in pamphlets filled with impenetrable jargon, aligned the vital humors of the body. It didn't just hold light, it held life. It could purify water, soothe fevers, and restore the vigor of youth. It was not a product. It was a cure. The Count, drowning in his debts, listened to this cynical poetry and saw a lifeline. Here was the miracle. A story so perfect, so attuned to the anxieties of the age, it couldn't possibly fail. The science was irrelevant. The narrative was everything. He summoned Richter and Helmut, and in the great hall of his castle, under the gaze of his ancestors, a pact was made. Richter would produce the crystal. Helmut would craft the lie. And the Count would stake his entire fortune, his lands, his title, the very legacy of his bloodline, on their success. The Etherean Crystal Manufactory was born. The gilded facade was no longer just an image, it was a business plan. The first shipments of curative goblets and pendants were sent to the courts of Europe, each nestled in a velvet-lined box with a certificate of authenticity penned by the good doctor. The problem of the Count's debt was about to be solved. Or so he believed. He had no idea he had just signed the death warrant for his entire region. The initial success was blinding. It was a tidal wave of gold. Florins and ducats poured into the Count's lands as the European elite clamored for the miracle cure from Bohemia. The Etherean crystal was a sensation, the subject of breathless gossip in the salons of Paris and the drawing rooms of London. Stories, carefully seeded by Helmut's agents, circulated about miraculous recoveries. An aging duchess whose migraines had vanished. A banker whose gout had miraculously receded. The company hired actors to give tearful testimonials in town squares. It was a symphony of deception, and every note was profitable. The Count's gamble seemed to have paid off. His debts were settled. His status was restored. He was no longer a desperate nobleman on the brink, he was a visionary, a captain of a new and miraculous industry. Richter's workshop grew into a sprawling manufactory, its chimneys belching smoke day and night. The demand was insatiable. They were no longer just selling a product. They were selling hope. But in Vienna, a different kind of man was watching. Professor Klaus Richter, no relation, a leading physician at the Imperial University, was a man of cold, hard facts. He dealt in anatomy and evidence, not vital humors and harmonic vibrations. And as he read the pamphlets and heard the wild claims, he felt the unmistakable chill of fraud. He smelled the scent of charlatanism on the wind from the north. He began to collect the curative goblets, subjecting them to rigorous analysis. He found nothing. Just sand, potash, and lead. A beautiful, inert piece of glass. He penned a polite but firm letter to the Count, outlining his scientific skepticism and requesting evidence. The letter was received with contempt. Who was this dusty academic to question their success? To challenge the lived experience of thousands of satisfied customers? Helmut drafted a scathing reply, dismissing the professor as a man blinded by jealousy, a relic of an old way of thinking. "We have the proof of our results," he wrote. "The professor has only the proof of his ignorance." This was the moment of hubris. The first crack in the crystal empire. They chose to ignore the warning. They chose to believe their own lie, for the alternative was unthinkable. Instead of caution, they chose expansion. To meet the voracious demand, the manufactory needed more fuel. The ancient forests on the Count's lands were not enough. So he made a fateful decree. He offered the local farmers triple the price for wood than they could ever make from wheat or rye. The choice was simple. The logic was brutal. Why plow a field for a year for a handful of coins when you could fell a tree in a day for a pocketful of silver? The peasants abandoned their farms. The fields, which had fed the region for centuries, were left fallow. The plows rusted. The land grew quiet. The entire economy of the province reconfigured itself around a single, shimmering falsehood. The harvest was no longer grain. It was glass. The point of no return had been crossed. They had traded their food for a fantasy, and the winter was coming. The reckoning did not arrive as a letter from Vienna or a decree from the Empress. It came as a whisper, a fever, a pockmark. Smallpox. It arrived silently, carried on the back of a traveling merchant, and it found a population weakened by a poor diet, their granaries half empty. The disease, which had always been a terrifying but manageable threat, became a wildfire. This was the ultimate test. The Etherian crystal, the panacea for all of life's ailments, was now faced with a true plague. And it was here that the lie collapsed into something far more sinister. Desperate villagers, terrified of the spreading sickness, flocked to the manufactory, spending their last coins on the curative goblets. They drank water from the rainbow crystal, believing in its protective power, even as their neighbors and children succumbed to the fever. The ultimatum was not delivered by a man. It was delivered by reality. The choice was stark: admit the fraud, confess that their miracle cure was a worthless piece of glass, and face the wrath of a terrified, betrayed, and starving populace. Or double down. Helmut made the choice. He stood before the panicked crowds and, with the conviction of a prophet, declared that the crystal's power was absolute. Any deaths, he claimed, were due to improper use or a weakness of faith. He published new pamphlets with elaborate instructions on how to activate the crystal's full potential through prayer and incantations. He was no longer just a liar. He was a merchant of a beautiful, useless death. For Anton Richter, this was the breaking point. The artisan who had only wanted to create beauty was now an accomplice to mass delusion, watching people die with his creation clutched in their hands. The rhythmic clang of his workshop, once a sound of pride, now sounded like the hammering of coffin nails. He confronted Helmut, begging him to stop, to tell the truth. Helmut's response was cold and pragmatic. "If we tell them the truth now," he hissed, "they will not just burn the manufactory. They will tear you, me, and the Count limb from limb. We sold them a dream. Our survival depends on them never waking up." But the truth could not be contained. The death toll mounted. Entire families were wiped out, their precious crystal goblets sitting untouched on their nightstands. The professor in Vienna received his final, irrefutable proof: mortality statistics. The region that had embraced the crystal cure had a death rate 30% higher than neighboring provinces that had relied on quarantine and traditional medicine. He sent his report directly to Empress Maria Theresa. The deal with the devil had come due. The people, their bodies racked with disease and their stomachs aching with a hunger the crystal could not cure, finally saw the truth. Their faith, once a shield, curdled into a murderous rage. The whispers of discontent became a roar. They had been sold a lie while their children died. They had traded their harvest for ash. The price of survival was to be paid in blood. The end came with fire and pitchforks. A mob of enraged, starving peasants, their faces hollowed by grief and famine, descended upon the Etherian crystal manufactory. They were not a disciplined army, they were a force of nature, a consequence. They smashed the gleaming windows, tore down the gates, and set the workshops ablaze. The beautiful, impossible crystal, stacked in its thousands, exploded in the heat, sending showers of shattered rainbows into the smoke-choked sky. The great lie was cleansed by fire. When the mob reached the Count's castle, they found the gates barred. But there was no resistance. The Count von Uend zu Harak, the man who had staked his legacy on a fantasy, was found in his study. He had dressed in his finest regalia, and with a single, steady pistol shot, had rendered his final account. It was a more honorable end than the mob would have granted him. Dr. Helmut, ever the pragmatist, had seen the end coming. He had vanished days before, his carriage laden with gold, disappearing into the fog of history, a ghost who had profited from a catastrophe and left others to pay the price. Only Anton Richter remained. The master artisan. He did not run. He simply stood amidst the smoldering ruins of his life's work, the air thick with the smell of burnt timber and shattered dreams. He was found by imperial dragoons, a silent man covered in ash, the symbol of how a noble craft had been corrupted and destroyed by greed. The new era in Bohemia began not with a bang, but with the quiet, grim work of rebuilding. The fields were plowed again. The granaries were refilled. The world moved on. The rainbow crystal became a cautionary tale, a whisper of madness from a bygone age. The empire still looked vast on the map, a powerful facade of Habsburg authority. But everyone knew it was a giant with a wound, a scar left by a beautiful lie. The shards of iridescent crystal were picked up by children for years, glittering fragments of a rainbow in the ash, a reminder of the time their parents had tried to drink light instead of water. It wasn't a tragedy of science versus faith. It was just a business plan that ran out of customers.